Now let's talk for a minute about why Star Trek became popular in the first place. So sci-fi kind of became a popular genre, and I mean relatively popular at the time. It would become much popular later in kind of the early 20th century. And you had writers sort of telling sort of short stories mostly that would be published in magazines, and that was how the average person, if they consumed sci-fi at all, that's how they would do it. Now originally sci-fi, when it first started, as where I think people tend to define it, and obviously there's the issue of Mary Shelley arguably really started sci-fi with Frankenstein, and I'm not arguing that, but I'm going to jump forward to H.G. Wells and talk about him and Jules Verne. So in those early sci-fi novels, which really kind of helped establish the genre, you had stories that really weren't about action and adventure and all that. They were more about, again, the whole thing of holding up societal issues in part, and also just about big ideas, big concepts. And they weren't really so much about the characters in general. And if they were, it definitely wasn't about the antagonist. Okay, like in War of the Worlds, who are the bad guys? It's the Martians. Who are the heroes? I don't remember the name of the main protagonist in the War of the Worlds because he's really not that important. It's not really about him. It's about the Martians. It's about the threat they represent, and of course, they represent this whole sort of allegory of colonialism. The idea of colonialism being turned upon Britain, right? And same thing with, say, 2000 Leagues Under the Sea. Who's the antagonist in 2000 Leagues Under the Sea? Captain Nemo. And who are the heroes? Well, I remember Ned Land was the sailor, but I don't really remember the others because it's really not about them. It's more about Nemo. And it really, sci-fi was more, it wasn't about heroism and about heroic adventures. But that kind of changed when characters like John Carter came along. And particularly what I'm going to talk about here is about Buck Rogers. So Buck Rogers started being published in the 19 teens, I believe. In that comic strip, they presented this vision of the future, and it's one we all see as kind of very retro and in some ways even kind of silly, with the rocket ships, that sort of are like submarines in space, and the jetpacks and the ray guns and all that. But that stuff was seen for a long time as what the future was going to be. Now we look at it now, and I still like that stuff. But I see it as a kind of sort of quaint kind of what could have been. It's again, it's kind of quaint, it's kind of charming, but it's not something I look at and see it as a viable vision of what our society is going to be and what space travel is going to be. And eventually, as we got into the early years of the space age, particularly, that vision of the future began to fade because we began, real world developments, particularly technological developments and societal developments, made us realize whatever the future is going to be, it's not going to be this, and sort of the idea of this being the future couldn't be maintained anymore. And that's why Star Trek, I think part of the reason why Star Trek stepped in and became popular, because it kind of stepped in at the right time and addressed the optimism of baby boomers at the time. It addressed the way the space race was really kind of firing people's imaginations. And that's part of what made Star Trek popular, the whole optimistic vision of the future and all of that. But I think that future is increasingly, Star Trek is kind of running into the same problem that, say, Buck Rogers and that earlier sort of retro sci-fi stuff encountered, which is real world events, I think, are beginning to overtake it. Like, for instance, the original series, and let me stop sharing this article. I got an image of the bridge. Okay. So we've got the bridge from the original series. And this, let's be honest, this is already like antiquated, outdated. It's not No one's going to look at this and say this is what the future looks like. And like, and I'm not trying to debate whether it's good or not. I love the original series, and and I love this set, but we're fans, and I'm assuming you guys do too, but we're fans who grew up with this stuff. We were sort of weaned on it. And is this something that's going to appeal to new fans? They're going to look at this, and they're probably going to look at this in much the same way that we would look at those old rocket ships in the old serials from the 50s, Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. We say, oh, well, that's kind of charming. Lord Thoth, you got to go? Okay, man. Well, thank you for stopping by anyway, and have a good dinner. And but this isn't something they're going to look at and take seriously as a vision of the future. And I think you can even look at the next generation and their bridge in much the same way. I think it's getting to that point as well. Let me bring that up. Okay, so and then we have the next generation bridge. And again, I don't think anyone's going to look at this and take it seriously as something that, this is what the future is going to look like. And honestly, even at the time, and again, I'm not saying whether I like it or don't like it. I like it. I love the old Enterprise D. I love Next Generation and all that. But let's face it, this even back in the day, I know me and my friends would kind of make jokes about how this bridge looks like the lobby of a hotel. It looks like a lounge at the local Marriott or something. It doesn't really look like a spaceship. And yeah, cruise ship bridge, sure. And the point I'm getting at here, again, as I said earlier, Star Trek's got to evolve in some way, I think, in order to stay current and stay relevant. And that's assuming that it even can. I'm not 100% convinced that it can do that, but if it can, it's got to make some changes. DJ says, albeit dated, we can argue that it requires advanced tech to remain structural integrity with that ceiling. Yeah, right. Well, the whole structural integrity field, and inertial fields and all that. I mean, that's a whole. We could go on all day about the viability of Star Trek technology in the real world. You know, I mean, do transporters actually kill you every time you use it? That whole thing. So I do think there has to be some sort of change or evolution in the look of the series. Now, again, I'm not saying that what they're doing with Secret Hideout is a good idea. Again, I think like a lot of people, I think it's just there's way too the sets are too dark. And let me bring up. I think this is the bridge from Strange New Worlds. I think. And again, I'm not saying this is the answer. But it's the answer, whatever it is probably going to be something closer to this than to what we've had in the past. It's going to have to be because, again, convincing you and me to watch a Star Trek series isn't what's going to take Star Trek into the future. What's going to take it into the future is going to be getting younger people excited about the show, and you're going to have to give them something that meets to some degree, in some way at least, meets their expectations, and that seems to them like something viable that we could have in the future. DJ says bad for people with cataracts. Yeah, I mean there's plenty of lens flare, isn't there? And again, it's the bridge is so big. That's another thing. They've made these modern sets are so big, like in Strange New Worlds. Pike's quarters, they're huge, and they're ridiculously big. It's like bigger than Picard's quarters in Next Generation. And yeah, I mean that's a whole other issue though, is how big should the ships be? How big should the sets be, et cetera, et cetera. But my point here being there needs to be some sort of change. I'm not saying I know what that change needs to be, but there is something needed to move more to something close to this, I would say. Otherwise, Star Trek is increasingly just going to become aesthetically kind of outdated and viewed again, kind of like the sort of retro Buck Rogers type sci-fi is this sort of quaint idea of, oh, what could have been, rather than a viable vision of the future. And obviously, a lot of Star Trek's appeal has always been based around this notion that this is what our future could be. This is what we could do. We can get here, if we can address all our problems in society and all that. So now I want to talk for a second about, again, there's the issue of real world events and real world technology sort of making sci-fi obsolete in various ways. That's kind of in part what happened with Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and that sort of thing. Because eventually it came to a point where real world technology was developing in such a way. That's sort of what is happening with Star Trek now, is I think we're seeing more and more change coming in the coming decades as far as how society is going to change, particularly with the development of AI. And I think that's going to overtake events in Star Trek and make it increasingly difficult to look at Star Trek as what the future is going to be. And I think a lot of that, again, it goes to the whole issue of artificial intelligence and how that's going to develop. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about the idea of the singularity. We're going to reach this point where we can have human level artificial intelligence in the real world, and how is that going to impact society? And we all continue to talk about it, as this thing that's coming eventually, but we're getting there. And I think we're maybe closer than a lot of people realize. Most sources I look at seem to project the singularities being somewhere in the 2030s, 2030 to 2040, somewhere in there. Masters Maniac Mexico says, I would argue that Star Trek would be like He-Man. I know you're right, but I refuse to destroy my illusions. Yeah, well, I mean, He-Man in a way, but that's so much more kind of fantasy, I mean, that really leans more into, it's more kind of like Conan with sci-fi trappings, or something like that, rather than, it's more science fantasy than science fiction, it would be my argument. But again, we've got this article here, and this is from January 23rd, so just a couple of weeks ago, talking about how, it may be like within 7 years, so you're talking like 2030, so not that far off. And of course, the whole idea of the singularity is that once we have like a human level AI, all bets are kind of off as far as how technology is going to develop, because generally processing power in computers, it doubles about every 2 years is the general trend. It may be a little more, a little less, but generally about every 2 years. But then once you have an AI that's of human intelligence, let's say, okay, then let's say 2 years later, then at a minimum, probably you're going to be able to make an AI that's got twice as much processing power in that, and then theoretically, at least, twice as intelligent as a human. Okay, now what is that AI going to come up with as far as new technologies, new ways to, new computer processing abilities, stuff like that? That AI could then presumably come up with ways to shorten the development span of processors. Now you've got processing power doubling every year. Okay, now then a year after that, you've got an AI that is 4 times as smart as a human. Now, what's that one going to come up with? And again, maybe you see processing development, the span of processing power doubling shortened again. Maybe it's 6 months. But I mean, you see if you extrapolate out, you see where it goes, right? Within a frighteningly short amount of time, we could have AIs that are, I mean, just vastly smarter than a human, vastly smarter. And where does that take society? But in particular, how do you then, if you've got that happening, how does that work with Star Trek and the lore of Star Trek? Because again, in this Star Trek future, yes, the technology is advanced at all, but ultimately, because it's this humanist vision of the future, humans are still very much in charge, and we do most everything. Yes, we use technology to aid us. We use computers to like run analyses and simulations and stuff like that. But ultimately, we're the ones making the choices and taking most of the risks. And when you start looking at where AI could go in the real world in our lifetimes, that becomes more and more in doubt, I think. And you really can't, then it becomes harder and harder to maintain the illusion that Star Trek's future is what is really going to happen. And I think that in the long term is really one of the big issues. And then there's the whole development of robotics. There's another article here. Let me bring that up. Okay, so you've got this new tech startup called Figure, and again, and this is from like a an article 2 days ago, like Friday or Thursday or Friday. So this is brand new. Figure promises first general purpose humanoid robot. Startup team includes veterans from IHMC, Boston Dynamics, and Tesla. And they're planning to develop a basically a droid, a humanoid robot. And okay, let's say they can get this within 10 years, 20 years, something like that. And I don't think there's any reason to think they can't. I mean, we've all seen that footage of robots dancing and stuff like that. So I don't think that this is something that's far fetched. Now, you pair that with the development in AI. I mean, you're looking at a real world data within, I mean, I don't think within 20 years, probably certainly within 40 years, I would say. And again, how does that sort of break Star Trek lore, and how does Star Trek remain viable when you've got that happening in the real world? DJ says we're very far off from a sentient AI, in my current opinion. Well, maybe. And again, and I'm not saying with that I know for a fact this is all going to happen. I don't. But it seems like, I think, a significant possibility. And again, I think in a world like that, Star Trek kind of becomes increasingly kind of irrelevant. So I think ultimately what we're looking at here is, I think Star Trek has maybe one more period if it's handled well and if they do it right, which they probably won't. Because honestly, like Masters Maniac Mexico said, I think it may just be that Star Trek's goose is cooked, and it's already had its best days and it's just downhill from here. That might be the case. But I do think if they were smart and if they did it well, they could have maybe one more period of sustained success, around another series. And again, that would be maybe like, say, something based on the Enterprise G or H or whatever. But I think, and that might take them forward for another decade or so, something like that, maybe 10, 12 years. But I think after that, I'm just not sure how viable Star Trek's going to be as a franchise going forward, because the real world and how technology develops and how society develops is going to keep impacting how people view the show inevitably. And in the long run, I just don't know if you're going to be able to sustain a belief in a Star Trek style future, unfortunately. Did I miss anything? I had a list of things here to touch on. I think I hit everything. Yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.